Hi, and welcome. My name is Katie Reneslacis, and I'm a PhD student here at Harvard in the Department of Romance Languages and Literatures. I'm pleased to welcome Dr. Patricia Gaborik, a professor at the University of Calabria, here with the support of the George F. Kennan membership at the Institute for Advanced Study. Dr. Gaborik has recently published her book, Mussolini's Theater, Fascist Experiments in Art and Politics, and has joined us today for a discussion of that book. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Katie.
So I'd love to start with the central duality that your book wrestles with, which is that between politics and aesthetics. You write that the coexistence of these two facets is completely essential for the establishment of a truly fascist theater under Mussolini. And the term that you give us for his avoidance of outright propaganda is strategic aestheticism. Strategic being a term that points toward the future rather than ideology, which is more past-oriented. Could you tell me a little bit more about this tension that exists between past and future, between politics and aesthetics, and how that contributes to Mussolini's quest to create this new Italy, new man, and of course, new theater?
Sure, thanks. I think one of the things that I began with when I really started putting this book down on paper was, what do people tend to think about the relationship between art and politics? What do people tend to think about art under a totalitarian regime? I think generally speaking, a lot of our ideas about what may have happened in Fascist Italy come to us through Nazi Germany, which was actually a very different, it was a very different situation there. Things worked really differently, but sort of departing from general ideas we have about Nazi Germany, people tend to think, okay, well, as fascism, as propaganda, there's not a whole lot else going on. In the case of Italy, that simply wasn't true. Propaganda was a sort of, it was present definitely, but it was a minor concern in the theatrical arts, which, you know, when you kind of start to talk about that and make that claim, people kind of raise their eyebrow at you like, that doesn't really seem possible. How is it that that's possible? So this was, I think, one of the sort of guiding questions when I really first, you know, began serious investigation into the period. Became clear to me at a certain point that there was a real pedagogic function to the theater. And when I talk about strategy, that's about thinking about what the theater can do in the long term, right? The goal isn't just, you know, sort of immediate propagandistic points for the regime. We're not going to tell you how great the regime is with this play, because that would be, let's say that would be a tactic, right? If we think in terms of, you know, this sort of the language of war, which I think is appropriate for what the fascists are doing. A tactic is, let's deal with the immediate problem, which is, you know, getting loyal subjects for the regime. Strategy is thinking in longer term. Let's build fascist citizens. These things aren't, of course, completely different, but they're also not completely the same, right? It's a little bit less about let's get loyal party adherents, and it's a lot more about how can we use the theater to construct a new sort of citizen, really. One of the things that I think is very well known about Italian fascism and about Mussolini's interest in the arts is his interest in cinema. There's this sort of famous quote where he says, the cinema is the strongest weapon, right? And so that led people for a long time to think the theater was a kind of a secondary art. But actually Mussolini talks, and he talks about this specifically at a certain point, a cinema as a strong weapon for propaganda, but theater as a weapon that is more educationally efficacious, right? It has a stronger educational effect. And so that is something that we really see in the theater programming of the period and in the kind of endeavors that the regime decides to give money to or not. So we have this entire range of performance. There is a propagandistic element. There are some sort of propagandistic programs that are made. But the fascist regime has its eye on a bunch of different questions, a bunch of different problems. How do we make the commercial theater, for example, a little bit more enlightening? How do we raise the cultural bar a little bit there? They're very interested in mass theater projects, but they renovate ancient theaters to perform ancient dramas, right? Classical Greek tragedies, which is undeniably about some sort of cultural elevation, education. There may be ideological correspondences, but that's always sort of not necessarily a secondary question, but a parallel question, I think, right? So this is one of the things that began to interest me. And then to go back to the point about, seeing through the lens of Nazi Germany, one of the great differences is that Mussolini is quite interested in avant-garde production, in modernist production, which of course in general terms wasn't the case under Hitler. And so there are a handful of enterprises, both in commercial theater, although fairly elite, but elite commercial theater, and in the educational system that the regime puts forward that is about innovation in theatrical practice. How does any of this make sense? It doesn't make sense through the promotion of a fascist ideology, but through the construction of people who appreciate the art of the theater as an art. And that's something that I think once, that is absolutely something that hasn't been understood about this period, and I think it's fundamental that we don't lose sight of that long-term mission. Not that that's necessarily a positive mission. I mean, that's something to be very clear about. But this wasn't about today. It was about tomorrow, and it was about the next generation as well.
Excellent. Thank you so much.
Sure.
So this discussion of the new theater and the creation of this new enterprise brings us to another dualism that we find in your book, which is that between lived reality and theater or fiction. And you first apply this to Mussolini himself at the beginning of your book when you are disentangling his roles as actor, as character, and as orator. And you tell us several times throughout that Mussolini uses playwriting and theater and theatrical expression to sort through his own thoughts and his decision-making and his courses of action. I was wondering, to what extent do the primary sources that you've consulted for this book, as well as other research projects that you're working on now, to what extent do they show Mussolini's tendency to create a public character to be the face of the fascist regime in Italy?
Oh, that's a great question. To a great extent, I would say. And the comment that you begin with, right, this sort of image of Mussolini and his role as an orator, and he's already the face of fascism, right? He is fascism. So we see his thoughts about this, even with respect to his, and I say this in quotes, but his performances, right? That's, as you know, that's a sort of image of Mussolini and of fascism that I push back a little bit against. I mean, he's certainly interested in the presentation of self, but we don't want to mistake that for it was all show, it was all substance, right? But within that, in any case, he talks about his own appearances as fundamental in this way, as sort of an opportunity to model behavior for his citizens. One of a fantastic primary source that we have on this are the letters and the diary of Claretta Petacci, who was his, one of his many lovers, but I would say also his great love. And she will recount conversations that he had, and there are a series of them after his public appearances. And so he would say, did you see how I did that today? Did you see what I did? One of them that's really fantastic is he said, you see how I was standing so firm and not gesticulating too much, right? And there's one point that he makes about, this is the sort of let's say, strong warrior position. He's not that explicit about it, but it's very clear that, that sort of strength of stature is something that he's going for. And so that's a model for these future soldiers, right, that he's creating. Because there is an element that is very about, we have to create strong future soldiers. And there's also other elements. There's that. But something that's really interesting there, too, is he also says we have to show the rest of the world that we're not that stereotypical Italian, the mandolin players or something. I don't remember exactly the images he uses, but he's very explicit about that I am modeling for my citizens, but this is also the face that we're showing to the world, right? And so there is an element there where he says, we need to be serious and we need to be taken seriously, right? And so he tries to model that in his own behavior. Then he's got these playwriting initiatives of his own, right? In particular, the collaboration with Gioacchino Forzano, where he writes these, Forzano really writes them, but in varying levels of collaboration with Mussolini. And these are the great heroes of the Italian past or the Mediterranean past, Julius Caesar, Napoleon, both of whom were already very much tied to Mussolini. There was a sort of conscious reuse of their of images of them, and he is a sort of, a modern version of both of them. And then also Cavour, one of the heroes of the Risorgimento. That's an interesting choice for a few different reasons. But even there, it's very clear that in those texts, they're trying to very specifically draw the analogies between those figures and Mussolini himself. But it's very clear that these tragic figures are also behavioral models, right? This is something that we see in cinema as well, right? This sort of image of the man and the leader. And so you see it not only in various aspects of theater, but also, kind of across the other arts as well. There are definitely comments in censorship files as well about reasons for approbation of scripts, or even some adjustments that are made to scripts where it's very clear there that, this is not an element, if this is an Italian character in a play, this is not an element that we consider good of our character. So that's not an example that we can put on the stage for people to see. So that was not specifically tied to Mussolini, but that logic there is that the stage is somehow providing examples of behavior is very clear, and it shows up in several different aspects of Mussolini's thinking about it, right? In his own writing, thinking about his own public appearances, but then also in these broader institutional aspects like censorship. So it seems to me very, very consistent and ever present.
Amazing. So I love that you bring up censorship, because I'd really like to pivot a little bit to talk about Mussolini's role as censor, okay, which is something that you focus on a lot in chapter 4 of your book. And the fact that you put it in the context of cinema as well is fortuitous, because just this past April, the Italian Minister of Culture symbolically abolished the cinematic censorship laws that had been in place for over 100 years in Italy. So censorship has very much formed the Italian sensibility for quite a long time now. You write that Mussolini's particular brand of censorship is contingent and personalized instead of consistently restrictive. In what ways do you see that tendency toward instability in the censorial tradition for Mussolini? How is that influencing and altering or contributing to the censorship that already existed, that was already established even before Mussolini came to power?
Okay, that's a great question. And I think it's actually, it's really a fundamental question for understanding the workings of a regime like fascism. Because there again, I think we have kind of generalized, stereotyped notions of what a totalitarian regime does or what a fascist regime does. So we imagine this sort of very stark, inflexible kind of a system, right? And it's anything but that. It's quite fascinating. I think too, censorship, I think this is true for just about anything with the fascist period, but you really start to understand fascism when you look at it comparatively, just from a chronological point of view, because we can look at something, some aspects of fascist governance, and think that it's very particular to fascism, and then you realize not so much, right? One of the things, and I say this explicitly in the book, is there's a kind of non-uniqueness to fascist censorship with respect to before and after that I think is really important to understand. In fact, one of the interesting cases that I studied, one of the authors that I worked on quite a bit is Vitaliano Brancati, whose career spans fascism and the immediate post-war period under the Christian Democrats. And Brancati has a series of run-ins with the censorship team, but he actually has more problems under the Christian Democrats than he does under the fascists. And he writes an absolutely scathing attack on the Christian Democrat censors in 1952 over a case of censorship on him. And he basically says, this is the spirit of fascism and fascist censorship, but put in clerical dress, so it's even worse, right? And that, what he saw about the worst element was that there was the Catholic morality that was added on as a layer in the censorship process. That he said, well, at least that didn't exist under fascism. So now we have a sort of baseline political censorship, and then we add on top of it this moral vision, it's even worse. Censorship in the theater in Italy then doesn't get abolished until the 1960s either. So it's the same, so we have this sort of long thing. So one of the things when you think about fascism is it wasn't the only time that it was contingent. The contingency is something that actually makes it more similar to the before and after. But it's also the thing that's really surprising about fascist era censorship. I think one of the things, though, that is interesting there is that, and I make this point in the book, it was more flexible. It entailed collaboration between the censorship office and authors or producers to actually get, to adjust works so that they could go on board where both parties were happy with it. This doesn't necessarily mean, though, that it wasn't so bad, right? I think one of the things here is that uncertainty about the rules and uncertainty about the laws is potentially paralyzing as well, right? And I think that certainly, even in centuries prior to fascism, where we're talking about situations where censorship was really coming from the church, there's a lot of that going on as well in centuries prior. And so that's, I think, really something that's fascinating about censorship, that it's, sort of about fascist censorship in particular. It's absolutely non-unique. This is actually a project that I would love to do that I could never do on my own, but comparative censorship studies in the theater or in the film, because you see, and I talk about this too, in many ways, fascist theatrical censorship, and I would say that also means film, is no worse than the Hays Code in Hollywood, right? So what does that mean? There is still just an element of cultural concern and social control, and what is really political. And the lines really intersect. And that too is part of fascism's design, right? We can't any longer draw such a strict line between what is cultural and what is political. Did that answer enough of your question?
Absolutely did. Thank you so much. I think the international, the comparative element that you bring out there gives us all a lot to think about. And the modernity of this question also draws the questions of fascism into our current lives, and allows us to engage with your book in new and exciting ways. So thank you so much.
Thank you. Hope that's true.
And thank you so much for joining us today for this conversation. And thank you all for joining us and listening in to learn more with Dr. Gaborik.